Dennis,
Hey,
how
Felix.
are you?
Good to see you.
I think we can use this mic, we're good.
Hello and welcome to the University-Community Forum. Our speaker today is Professor Dennis O'Rourke, who received his PhD in 1980 from the University of Kansas, and by reading his research interests in a field that you might loosely call global anthropology. He's had experience in his research in many areas, from the Bering Strait down the coast of Alaska to early peoples in Arizona, and then into Mexico and Belize, and also into the Ukraine and Russia, and even Siberia. Much of his career has been spent at the University of Utah, and he's also been very active in being presidents of scientific societies in his field and editors of scientific journals. In January of this year, he was appointed as a distinguished professor at the University of Kansas. And he will talk today about Beringia and the global dispersal of modern humans.
Well, thank you very much for that.
Use the microphone so we can hear you good.
You bet. Now, if I can just remember not to wander around as I talk.
One just has to be pointing at your mouth.
It's turned
Tip it up.
on, but you have to talk fairly directly into the end.
Well, no, it just has to be pointed at your mouth.
All right. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, that's better.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much for having me. I'm very pleased to be here. It's also nice to be back home in Kansas after many years away. What I want to talk about today is a bit of my research, particularly most recent material, that we've been interested in looking at the dispersal of people into the Western Hemisphere from Asia. Historically, I think, the dispersal of people throughout Eurasia, Africa and Eurasia, has always been thought to be a different, separate event from the dispersal of people into the Western Hemisphere. And some colleagues and I have recently been arguing that we ought to see that as all part of the same process of human dispersals. But what I'm going to focus on today is the dispersal from Asia to the Western Hemisphere. And because I'm an anthropological geneticist, I have a particular approach, which is to use genetic data, genetic analyses, to try to clarify some issues about prehistory and how people moved around the planet in times past. I love this quote from one of my former colleagues, Henry Harpending, and his student Elise Eller, because in recent decades, since about the mid-1980s, the acquisition of genetic data has accelerated almost exponentially, so that our data and the tools we have to address questions of prehistory have gotten much more powerful and much more robust. So we're doing things now that a decade ago even we couldn't have imagined. And I'm going to be talking about some of those kinds of things today, but I'm going to try to skip most of the technical bits and get a flavor for the general questions that we're interested in and how they're being approached and what we think we might know that we didn't used to. So a little bit of setup is probably in order. Scientifically, it's clearly the case that the indigenous populations of the Western Hemisphere, North and South America, derive from ancestral populations in Asia. Exactly where in Asia is open to question, but the notion that they derive from Asian populations is very old. Jose de Acosta proposed this in the 1590s, and it has been confirmed with all kinds of research from data and from archaeology and biology repeatedly ever since. But it's of interest that although the origin of indigenous peoples in the Western Hemisphere may derive from Asia, they are quite clearly genetically and culturally distinct from whoever those Asian ancestors were. So there was a period of differentiation that developed the unique structure of indigenous American populations over time, and it's trying to get at that process that we're interested in. It leads us to two distinct questions, one of which archaeologists have been working on and arguing about for a long time, which is, when did the first people move to the Western Hemisphere? That has been a contentious issue for a long time and remains so. And a second question, which I'm a little bit more interested in, is not only when they got here, but when and where did the first identifiable Native American genome emerge? If Native Americans are distinct from their Asian ancestors, that distinctiveness had to arise over some period of time in some place. And if we can identify that, it might help us to set a time limit on movement of peoples. I think to get at that question, we have to look at a variety of different kinds of information from archaeology, from genetics and paleoecology, and I'll touch a little bit on each of those today. Most of us, if we've encountered ideas about the peopling of the Americas before, probably learned something like this version. There used to be large glacial ice masses covering northern North America. As those ice sheets began to melt and go away, there opened up a large ice-free corridor between the western and eastern ice sheets, and people filtered down through that ice-free corridor, mostly hunting large game like mammoths with these distinctive fluted points, usually assumed to be Clovis, and rapidly dispersed throughout in all of its dimensions, North and ultimately South America. I'm going to suggest that that's far too simplistic an idea of how people arrived on this continent. And I think 100 years ago, Lord Bryce had it right. The vaguer our notions about what actually happened, the easier it is to form solid opinions, because we may not be able to prove our ideas, but with the absence of data, we can't disprove them either. And I would like to think with this increasing robustness of genetic data and analytical tools, we might be beginning to get past this at least a little bit. So I need to go through a little bit of some summary informations to kind of set up the kind of background information that we have had and how we're trying to move forward from those ideas and some of the preconceived notions. I'm going to argue that it's likely that the origin of a distinctive Native American genome, that is a distinctive genetic character such that Native or indigenous American populations are distinct and recognizable from other populations of the world, ultimately required some degree of isolation sometime, somewhere. There'll be a caveat on that at the end. There is some limited evidence that that distinctive Native American genome may have already existed, or at least hints of it, by 24,000 years ago. And that comes from a study by a group in Denmark who's done a lot of work on particularly ancient DNA, which is my research specialty. They analyzed a very famous burial that's been known for decades from southern Siberia. It's called the Malta child. It turns out the Malta child was a young male who died, I believe, in his early teens or near teenage years. They were able to identify and sequence the entire genome of this individual who died 24,000 years ago. All of us have two genomes, a nuclear genome that we inherit from both of our parents, and a mitochondrial genome that we inherit solely from our mothers. The mitochondrial lineage is a Eurasian lineage for the Malta child, not a Native American one. And similarly, the Y chromosome, which men pass on to their sons, so it's a way to track paternal lineages, is also not Native American in the Malta child. But it's a Eurasian form that's closely related to the kind of Y lineages we find in the Americas, but it in fact itself is not found here. It's in that nuclear genome, which is very large and very complex, that the Danish scientist found this signature of some sequences that typically are not found in Eurasia, only found among Native American populations, and they argue that this is evidence that some proportion of the modern Native American genome that we find among indigenous peoples in the Americas today derive from this admixture event between an early incipient Native American group that was developing this identifiable Native American genome and a Eurasian population 24,000 years ago, or actually a little bit earlier. So if that's the origin of the Native American genome, it was present, at least in some form, 24,000 years ago in South Central Siberia. They inferred from that this admixture event occurred and that people then moved north and east through Siberia, ultimately across the Bering land bridge, and were the ancestors of the people that ultimately dispersed throughout North and South America. There are some reasons to question that inference. As a geneticist, when I see things like coverage of around 1x, meaning that every base in the genome was only observed on average one time, that tells me that we're not very secure about what that genome really is. You'll see a little bit later some examples where we have much deeper coverage than that. And I'm not sure there's much in the way of directional signal in that. It's hard to know whether that admixture event was the result of Native American populations, early Native American populations, traveling south and west, going away from the developing glacial masses at the beginning of the last glacial maximum, or if indeed it represents movement in the other direction, as those investigators suggested. If the former case is right, it's consistent with something that's been around for about the last decade, known as the Beringian standstill model. The Beringian standstill was proposed about a decade ago by a group of geneticists who argued that a group of individuals, Asian individuals, had already arrived on the land bridge by maybe 15 to 20,000 years ago, and as the last glacial maximum arose, ice masses continued to get larger and climate got worse and worse in the interior of continents, most people on the Asian side abandoned northern latitudes and left this population isolated on Beringia. And it's that isolated population that stayed in isolation for 8 to 10,000 years that gave rise to the distinctive Native American genome.
And is that in Siberia?
That's exactly on the Bering land bridge.
Oh, right
you
on the
can
land
think
bridge.
of it where the Bering Strait is today.
Right. Oh my.
And I'm going to argue it's just south of the Bering Strait on what was then dry land but is now under the Bering Sea.
Isn't the timing backwards on that?
Say-
Because they found it 24,000 years ago in Siberia?
Yep. I'll come back to that
Okay.
later. Yep. In any case, the Beringian standstill suggests that, so here's modern Alaska, and there's the Chukchi Peninsula of Siberia, and all of this is the Bering land platform. And the Beringian standstill suggests there was a population here, and after the last glacial maximum, or near it, they dispersed in multiple directions. This, by the way, is, of course, Siberia. There's Kamchatka. Malta is right here near the southern tip of Lake Baikal in the Trans-Baikal region. So there's another bit of information that we have all assumed and been working with for some time that is probably questionable, and that is archaeological data suggested that the earliest peoples to the America were present in very, very small numbers. Tiny groups migrated to the Americas and then grew very rapidly. As a geneticist, very small groups means we're likely to experience something called a founder effect, that is a tiny number of people selected from a larger parent population will not carry all of the genetic variation of that parental group. There will be reduced variability, and in small populations that variability will be reduced even further by a process known as genetic drift. In fact, now that we have so much more genetic data, the evidence for that kind of bottleneck effect is not nearly as strong as we expected it to be. There's only a minor reduction in variability in indigenous American populations relative to global averages, which argues against very tiny founding populations. But one of the things that still is true, and it's contrary to our expectation, is that eastern Beringia, which essentially is Alaska today, is depauperate of genetic variation. If we look at the populations, the modern populations in Alaska today, they have very little genetic variation. In population genetic terms, we always expect that source populations will have the greatest variability, and dispersing daughter populations, which are smaller, will have less. But we have lots of variation in all Native American populations today, and almost none in the area where they're supposed to have come from. So this is a bit of a conundrum. I will also point out that the vast amount of genetic work that's been done has focused almost exclusively on mitochondrial DNA. That's changing, but the kind of DNA that we all inherit from our mothers, and we can identify distinct lineages, maternal lineages, that characterize indigenous American populations, none of which are found in Asia, although similar and closely related lineages are, but virtually none of the Native American lineages are found in Asia. And we find all of the major founding lineages of the Americas in samples where we have ancient DNA data greater than 8,000 years old. And I just want to point out that although our technology is increasing rapidly and allowing us to access genetic information from people that lived in the past in ways we couldn't do not long ago, it's still a very small amount, and we're just really getting started on this effort. This slide is less than 6 months old. It's already a little outdated, but there are only about 7 or so individual samples in the Americas that we have any ancient DNA for that exceed 8,000 years in age. If we're talking about dispersal events at 15 to 20,000, these are long after the fact. We don't have anything really early, and of these, only the 3 in blue have yielded genomic data, meaning whole genomes that have been sequenced, as opposed to just small little bits of DNA and markers that might help us identify a lineage. So part of what I've talked about is we have had certain expectations based on prior research. We thought we sort of knew how things worked. It's really hard to change people's mind. That's what I refer to as the received wisdom problem. Once we think we know something, it's really hard to change our mind. And so this is a slide I put in mostly for my geneticists and anthropological colleagues to tweak them a little bit. Our paradigm should not be inviolate. We should constantly be questioning our assumptions. The fact that we hold an opinion or a position or have made certain assumptions really doesn't constitute data. We ought to be constantly challenging those things and questioning them. The fact that we simply offer an alternative isn't actually a test of that hypothesis. it requires a little more work, and that we ought to continue to be curious and not just settle for the answer that seems to be convenient. So I told you I'd say a little bit about paleoecology. One of the things that, in my view, in the last 3 to 5 years, has really been important to both archaeologists and anthropological geneticists is that we have begun to integrate modern data from reconstructions of early environments, the environments in which people would have lived. One of the problems with the Beringian standstill model has always been, and I'll paraphrase one of my dear friends and close colleagues, well, it can't be true. What would they have eaten? If you're sitting out on the middle of the Bering landform and the only thing wandering around are mammoth, and you have no way to build a fire, and it's the dead of winter in the middle of the last glacial maximum, you're probably in trouble. This notion that the entire landform was a uniform environment, that it was mostly barren, and people simply could not make an effective living there is a very widespread belief and assumption. In recent years, colleagues of mine, Scott Elias and Nancy Bigelow, have been doing cores in the Bering Sea, deep sea cores from the Bering Sea, and along the coastal edges of some of the islands, the Pribilofs, and along the islands, or the coast of western Alaska. And what they're finding is when they look at the information, particularly the species that of things like insects and plants that they can see in deposits in those cores, that's not at all what Beringia looked like. In fact, Beringia was probably, at least southern Beringia, from the Bering Straits south, all of this landmass here, was probably a shrub tundra zone. We've always assumed that the entirety of the landform was a mesic tundra, meaning very dry, sparse plants, little way to make a living. If it's a shrub tundra zone, as the new paleoecological data suggest, there were pockets, we call them refugia, where there were trees, ducks, small mammals, grasses, forbs, all kinds of things that would have made it easily possible for humans to have lived and hunted and made a living in these refugia areas all throughout the southern part of the Bering Land Bridge. It's a wonderful story. The problem is it's all underwater, and while cores are nice, archaeologists are frustrated because you can't go down there and excavate sites and actually see what's going on. But it does tell us that our assumptions about the environment of the land bridge have been wrong for a very long period of time. One of the things that is critical is it's clear that there were trees, both conifers and